Something which I did this week, read quite a lot of Dr. Seuss books. Gosh, it's a little bit of a vocal workout reading Dr. Seuss, and yes, it was the particularly tricky one, Fox and Socks. That is a tough poem to read out loud. I mean, is it a poem? Is it literature? I don't know. Maybe it's a bit of both. Let's bring in the experts on this. New Zealand author and poet, Libby Kirkby McLeod. You're a Dr. Seuss fan, Elizabeth?
I am, but I just thought there was a funny thing that you set up. Was it poetry or was it literature? Surely it can be both.
Surely it can be both, and we'll get into the details of this. Talking poetry today. Now, last time we were chatting, talking about where do you start if you're wanting to get into reading poetry. Where's a good place to start to find a style of poetry that speaks to your spirit, as it were. This time we're upping the game a little bit. Where do you start when it comes to writing your own poetry? I'm a little bit nervous. It's been a while, honestly.
Well, a lot of people, when they start to read poetry, or even if they're not reading poetry, they still have a call in their heart, a feeling that they want to write their own strong emotional experiences out. And poetry just seems to fit that for a lot of people, those strong emotions or life experiences that don't seem to fit any other kind of form of writing. And so a lot of people don't know quite, like you said, where to start.
Yeah.
Now that's because there's probably as many places, as many ways to write poetry as there is when you read poetry, as many different forms, right?
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. There is no right way. Don't let anybody tell you that you have to know how to count a meter or how to write a sonnet before you're allowed to give it a go yourself.
Yeah, I mean, when I think of poetry, I think, okay, I've got to talk about myself in the third person, maybe as a cloud or a flower or something like that. I mean, that's how the classics did it. But look, I'm no Dr. Seuss, but it doesn't even need to rhyme, does it?
It doesn't, but if you like rhyming poems, oh, great, write a writing poem. What I think you need to do is to think about the poems that you like. And, you're talking about third person. Confessional poetry is huge, particularly since about the 1960s.
Yeah.
People being very direct about their writing in the I, writing about their own experiences. I think the most important thing to remember when you're writing poetry, unless you're writing what's called slam poetry, which is meant to only be spoken, you're writing for both the ear and for the eye. Mm-hmm. So you need to think about how both it sounds and how it looks. And then, yes, also, you're quite right. Poetry is often, but doesn't have to be, quite full of metaphor and simile. And when you're thinking about that, it's thinking about being really specific. Yeah. So not just, not just a field. Don't just write about a general field. Write about your lawn the year that your father couldn't mow it because his mother was dying. Yeah. Be specific about your images.
So cranking up the adjectives, being a bit creative, sitting with, I suppose, what we're doing with poetry, yes, graphically it's got to look on the page, but it's word pictures as well, as we're creating word pictures in other people's imagination as well as our own. I think this is one of the beautiful things about how we communicate at a deep level with poetry.
Yeah, so you're creating something that sounds good to the ear. So you're looking for things, those old-fashioned things you would have learned about at school, like assonance and alliteration, where you're repeating sounds. And I'll often go through, and this is another key thing, I'll often go through my drafts many, many times. Yeah. I think some think that a poem just falls out of you complete. That's not how it is for most poets. Maybe for some it is, but for me there's a lot of drafts that I go through, a lot of playing around with the line lengths, and I will often go through with a highlighter and just actually look at my draft at what sounds are coming up without me even realizing that I'm repeating certain sounds. I think, oh gosh, there's a lot of MOs, mo, no in this poem without me even intending to. Can I up that? Can I increase it? Can I look at other words that I could change out to increase that sound, that joy for the ear? When it comes to line length, the reason I say you're writing for the page is that something's nice and orderly and the lines are all even. That will suit a poem where you're talking about harmony. Yep. If you've got lines that are long and then short, jagged, floating around on the page, that might suit a topic where you're writing more about something that is causing you pain or uncertainty. Yeah. So thinking about not only what your poem is saying in the words that it's saying it, but also what it's saying on the page by the look of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. Is there a distinction in your mind? Because we started the conversation by saying, what's the difference between poetry and literature? Why not both? Poetry and lyrics, in some ways, is there 100% overlap, in your opinion, between writing lyrics for a song and writing poetry, or are these different subgenres? What do you think?
I think they're different. I think some lyrics are definitely poetry.
Yeah.
I think some lyrics, if you take away the music and you just see the words written on the page, they fall very flat.
Yeah. Okay.
And so I think you need to think, and that's kind of quite a good experiment for somebody to do, is to write out the lyrics of their favorite song and look at them on a page. Do they have the same power that they do when they're put to music?
Wow. No, that's a good thing. I mean, you mentioned the slam poetry as a style, and I'm not exactly gangster hip hop, but spoken voice as a form of poetry, and I suppose the performance aspect of poetry, that's become an increasingly important part of the genre?
It has. And when you think about it, it's just going back to the beginning, right?
Yeah.
One of the reasons that poetry did have rhyme is because it made it easier to remember, because it was a spoken form.
Yeah.
When you think of some of our greatest epics, and particularly in the Western tradition, they were written as poems. And so we're just rediscovering, I'd say. I don't think it's a new thing, but certainly it's been rediscovered, the joy of spoken poetry, and it is a huge booming area of poetry that particularly young people like to be involved in.
So when you're writing, composing poetry, as it were, speaking that out loud, this isn't something that you do in silence. You're playing with the sounds in your mouth. You're almost performing it to an audience of one as you're constructing it.
I don't write anything without speaking it out loud.
Yeah.
You probably know this working in radio, right?
Yeah.
I think it's always good to, even if I'm writing a piece of prose, to read it out loud. You'll find where you stumble over words.
Yep.
You'll find that what you say is slightly different from what's written on the page, because what you say is actually the more natural way that it should be written. And you'll hear if it's pleasing to the ear or not.
Why don't you talk about the spiritual component of poetry as well? Because last time we were chatting, talking about how poetry does speak to the spirit, that it connects in a deep way. I mean, some people would describe it as emotional, but I think there's definitely a spiritual component to poetry, and even poetry as a form of worship or a form of prayer. Has that been your experience?
Oh, absolutely. And you look at, again, this is not some new thing that Christians are suddenly discovering, that poetry can be powerful for the spirit. Yeah. It's something that we've known through our ancient Christian tradition and back into Jewish tradition. That's why you have Psalms. That's why you have Lamentations. Yeah. That's, why you have the prayers of, particularly, say, the Anglican Church, which is the tradition I'm involved in, where there are prayers that are written down, and they are quite poetic. I think that we just need to make sure that we don't think we're always doing something new and fresh, when maybe we actually tap into something quite ancient and deep, and maybe that it's ancient and deep and keeps coming back around because it does actually connect with us on a human spirit level. Yeah,
deep calls to deep, and sometimes at a deeply spiritual level, and a wonderful way of being able to communicate our essence, our spiritual core, not just expressing it to ourselves, but expressing it to others as well. Elizabeth, I mean, this is a great idea, and certainly for people perhaps like me who are thinking, gosh, that was a terrifying couple of weeks in my high school English class, actually consider revisiting it. Consider, taking some time with a pen and paper, taking some time to pray, asking God to help you in this process of expressing how you're feeling about life and about the things that are important to you and about your relationship with God. Taking the opportunity to express those in a poetical way. I think it's a wonderful challenge for us. Thank you so much for the work that you do. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Andrew.